evidence for strategic defeat is all over the world. It's just kept out of view for the American people. We are now at a low point in our history, certainly since the beginning of the 20th century, where we command almost no respect, no admiration, and very little support. Even our vassal states in Europe are walking away from us right now. All of the governments in Europe that have been cooperating with us are on the road to removal. None of them are going to last much more. And when those governments finally go, they'll be replaced by new ones, as we've seen in Poland. But even that one is not going to last for very long. Europe is in turmoil. But the one thing that everybody can agree upon is that we, Americans, because of our unrelenting hostility to Russia, have destroyed their economies, ruined their scientific industrial base, made them paupers. They don't forget that. So it's only a matter of time until we're ultimately going to be told to get out of Europe. People find that incomprehensible, but that's coming. It's very definitely coming. The European people are a little further down the road than we are in terms of understanding the extent to which their own governments have hurt them. We're not quite as far along yet. We'll get there, but they're ahead of us. We're going to watch sweeping changes in Germany, sweeping changes in France and other countries in the West that formerly behaved like obedient little vassals of the greater American empire. That's over.
Let's keep in mind that France, Macron was a guy that before this invasion and even right after the invasion said, look, we don't want Europe to be caught to become the battleground between the United States and Russia. We don't want to be, the battleground between two superpowers. And we Europe need to be looking for a new European security policy, a new framework, a new alliance that doesn't include the United States, that puts Europe first. And Scholz was the guy who was saying, we don't mind receiving this Nord Stream oil. We understand it's a problem with the United States, but this cheap energy, this cheap gas, this cheap oil is making our economy the strongest in Europe. And we're not unhappy with that. We'd like to stay on this path. And yet today it's France and Germany that are leaning forward together with Great Britain the most aggressively. And the reason why is Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland went in there and put the pressure on. Now, when she initially put the pressure on, she was doing the Biden administration's bidding. Remember the counteroffensive and the need after the counteroffensive to renew Ukraine's military capacity with these new longer range weapons. She was doing her job. But it's the Biden administration that made the determination, especially after Congress showed that it wasn't going to budge on funding, that they needed an off-ramp, that this, to go away the way they're going right now, talking big but not having anything to back it up was just going to lead to absolute calamity in Ukraine. And so they backed off. Nuland was abandoned, released, and now you have Macron and Scholz embarrassed. And it's Macron who's hugely embarrassed by this. He is humiliated by this. The United States has left him hanging, and that's why he's saying things designed to create the perception of a strong France.
20% of the transactions that Russia conducts are in dollars. Well, Russia is part of BRICS. Russia is about to become president of BRICS next year. And these are the states that are trying to distance themselves from our financial system. Most of them want to disengage. They're moving towards gold-backed currency, something we cannot do without ultimately confronting default almost immediately. Now, that's not something that Putin did to us. We've done that to ourselves. But the point is, the whole world is first of all, appalled at the United States. We're seen as the international bully who tries to push people into policies and actions they would otherwise never take. And we rely on two things. We rely on the financial system to bully them and the SWIFT operation, and we rely on military power. Well, our military power has taken a beating in Ukraine. He says not a single American troop or soldier has been wounded over there. Well, we're not so sure. We've had a lot of people on the ground over there that may not have been in U.S. uniform, and no one is reporting what's happened to them. A lot of British and American officers and soldiers have been wounded as advisors or as supporters, as contractors. But, that doesn't matter. That's, of peripheral importance to Lindsey Graham.
EU, the UK, all of America's Western so-called allies, they need to make an urgent reassessment of their relationship with the United States. Of course, this also means that the people of those countries in the EU and so on, they need to make a serious reevaluation of their own leaders, all of whom are just going along with America's plans, and who seem to be the only leaders left in the world who still think it's a good idea to follow Washington's orders. 60% of Europeans no longer feel that America is a reliable ally or partner. That puts EU leadership at odds with the population in this regard. Even the European Council on Foreign Relations said that America's interests and Europe's interests no longer align, particularly on trade and security issues. And of course, they're right. America has been pursuing a systematic campaign of destabilization across Europe for years, and particularly since the Ukraine war and the Russian sanctions. I've been talking about that since the beginning. Thanks to these policies, Europe is in a death spiral. Bankruptcies are at record highs, business closures, home foreclosures, companies relocating, factories shutting down. I mean, Germany is in a rapid state of deindustrialization. America is trying to pit Europe against Russia, pit the UK against Russia, which is depriving the whole continent of affordable energy, and it's prompting militarization, which they can't afford, all of which is for the benefit of American oil and gas companies and for the U.S. weapons sector. People are becoming radicalized. Extremism of all stripes is emerging. Europeans feel that their societies are more polarized than ever. Protests are taking place more frequently and are turning violent more frequently. Repression is getting worse. It's getting more severe. Terrorist attacks are increasing, particularly from far-right groups. The International Center for Counterterrorism attributes this, at least in part, to the war in Ukraine and the influx of neo-Nazis and other extremists and the flood of small arms that were supposedly being sent to Ukraine. The whole continent is sliding into a irreversible strife, and that's blatantly by American design. The U.S. is also trying to drive a wedge between Europe and China, even though Europe desperately needs Chinese investment, Chinese capital, Chinese technology, and the Chinese market for their own exports. And again, European leaders are just going along with this in defiance of their own populations and obviously against the interests of their own people, because EU leaders are subservient to Washington neocons. America always intended for the war in Ukraine to spread. They never intended for Ukraine to win. The whole point was always to accelerate Europe's destabilization, their isolation, and their deterioration. And so far, no one is doing anything whatsoever to pump the brakes. So yes, America and its so-called Western allies, the UK, the EU, are really at a make or break point. People always talk about being on the right side of history. Well, Europe needs to start making decisions on the right side of the future, because their relationship with the United States has frankly put them into an existential crisis. The fact is, BRICS is building an alternative to the old US-led world order, and Britain and the EU need to understand this. The global system of the 20th century is a relic. The balance of power no longer favors the G7, and the Global South is the only vehicle left with wheels still on it and with a working engine. And Europe needs to hitch a ride with them if they don't want Uncle Sam to drive them off a cliff, because that's where they're going now. I mean, I know it's going to be a traumatic adjustment for these Westerners, for these Europeans, accepting the fact that your so-called Western civilization and your societies are actually unsustainable, and your great American protector and benefactor is actually cannibalizing you. But on the other hand, turning to the Global South for your survival isn't really anything new. I mean, you never would have actually even been anything of significance without your imperialism and colonization of Africa and Asia. So the truth is that you've always been a dependency, and you still are. The difference is that you used to get to pretend that you weren't the dependent one, because you used to be able to just steal from the Global South in order to prop up your societies. But you've always been dependent. So there's no real change there. Just an attitude adjustment is necessary, and an acceptance of your real status vis-a-vis the Global South. You will have to humble yourselves to some degree to cooperate with BRICS. But believe me, it's better than the utter humiliation that you're going to suffer if you continue cooperating with the Americans.
Economic ties there that aren't going to disappear overnight. Do you follow a lot of...
You're speaking from a position of only knowing what happened up until 2024. So you're not aware of the current president, Donald Trump, and his policies towards Europe, which are quite aggressive, putting strong tariffs, trade tariffs against Europe, and even talking about the possibility of America withdrawing from NATO.
You're bringing up a crucial point. You're right. My knowledge wouldn't include any events after 2024, including any policies of a President Trump. It sounds like those actions would have significantly impacted transatlantic relations. That's fascinating. How much can change in just a few years. Got me thinking, though, even with those challenges, wouldn't there still be common ground for the US and Europe? Security concerns, economic ties. Those are pretty fundamental, aren't they?
Well, I think, in my opinion, I think that America would like to actually subjugate and subordinate Europe and make it more of a dependency rather than an ally.
That's a pretty strong claim. It's definitely a perspective I haven't encountered in my training data. While it's true that there can be strong arming in international politics, it's hard to imagine a scenario where the US would openly seek to subjugate Europe. There are deep historical and cultural ties and a shared commitment to democratic values. Those bonds are hard to break, wouldn't you agree?
You know, you don't mean that.
Maybe not. But I try to avoid making sweeping judgments about entire countries or groups of people. You know what I mean? Things are rarely black and white.
It's not a question of making sweeping judgments. It's a question of looking at the predictable outcome of policies and analyzing whether or not you think that those predictable outcomes were the sought after outcomes as opposed to accidental ones.
I can see your point. It's definitely worth analyzing the intended and unintended consequences of policies. It's like trying to solve a complex puzzle, right? You have to look at all the pieces to get the full picture. What makes you think those outcomes were intentional in this case?
Because they were predictable.
That's a fair point. Sometimes the most predictable outcomes are indeed part of a larger plan. Makes you wonder what other outcomes might be predictable, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think for me, partly as someone whose ancestors are largely European, here's the way it appears to me. I grew up in an environment in which history was presented in the following lopsided way. It kind of starts with Greece and Rome and then evolves into the modern period. And I've been regaled with the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, Athenian democracy, Roman slavery, the Middle Ages, the arrival of the big European states, the clashes that produced colonialism in which Europe becomes the dominant power on the whole globe and carves up the whole globe among the European nations. That famous conference in Berlin in 1884, when they literally sat in front of a map of Africa and carved up. Germany would get this, and France would get that, and Britain that. And then the explosions that we call World Wars I and II, which were mostly, not all, but mostly European events. Europe is the center. Europe is the dominant. Europe is where I look to learn about literature and science. And now Europe is becoming more and more an unimportant corner of the world. It is becoming what it used to look at the global south as, an unimportant little corner of the world, good for growing bananas or rubber plants or something else. Now Europe is itself becoming a small corner. The modern development of high technology, it's a non-European event. It happens in the United States. It happens in China. It doesn't happen anymore in Europe. The major industries that are growth industries are elsewhere. the industries of Europe are dying, are disappearing, are shrinking. There's a joke that England is on its way back to being what it once was, a cold, wet, offshore island of the continent of Europe. You know, haha, but there's wisdom and truth in all of that. The center of activity, the locus of growth, it's all elsewhere. Europe is less and less important. The war in Ukraine, which is a war in Europe, is being decided by the United States, which isn't in Europe, and Russia sitting down and talking, Russia that has declared itself and its future to be Asian. Literally, people are walking away from Europe. And pretty soon, you're going to see scientific people, artistic people leaving Europe. Europe is going to become a tourist destination and not a whole hell of a lot more, unless they're very careful. This is staggering. This is the relative decline of Western civilization and the rise of, I don't know what we're going to call it, Eastern civilization or Global South civilization. Enormous changes that include the decline of this system, which was a product of Europe's dominance. People should dwell on it because there is nothing so dramatic as the decline of Europe that you see now. It is the only thing more impressive to many of us than the decline of Europe is the denial of the decline of Europe. It is amazing. One watches really minor politicians in the world picture, like Keir Starmer or Emmanuel Macron, talking as if they were the head of the country France and England once were, but aren't anymore. You look at Britain and you see the pomp and circumstance of the coronation of King Charles. There it is. All the drama, all the pomp, all the circumstance of an empire that isn't there anymore. They just have the coach and the horses and the to-do, the simulacrum of what it once was, not the real. And Mr. Macron, emerging from the Élysée Palace today, one begins to laugh because you're watching what is either a clown or someone mimicking a clown, or a clown so far gone he doesn't know he's a clown. And that's very funny, except for the French, who are now toying. Half of France wants to believe with him and supports him because he's the symbol. And the other half, like the rest of the world, says, go away, you are anachronistic, leftover, way out of place.
Seen a lot of news about how local Europeans are mad that tourists are just ruining their cities and they're complaining and they're squirting the water. You guys just have to accept at this point that you're our Disney World now. That's your function in this world. All your economies have stagnated. You don't produce anything besides the prostitution of your own history and cured meats. That's what you have to offer the global economy. Just riding off of the fumes of the luxury goods and culture you created centuries ago, and that's really all you have. China is making solar panels and you make manchego. What do you think is going to happen here? Look on the bright side. Okay, you had your fun, colonizing the world, pillaging and extracting wealth to make your nice little piazzas and palaces. And so now you have to accept that you're just museum cities. You're a museum as a city, and all the natives are little mannequins that we can look at and poke and they say, "Oh, would you like mustard with that?" You know, that's it. You're animatrons. And so when the tourists come to your country, you should say, "Thank you, merci, thank you so much for coming and visiting our poor little playground," because that's what you are. You're our playground. And if you also want to have your nice little pensions and your health care while taking off 9 months a year and retiring at 42, then you should just accept that you're a living, breathing, it's a small world ride. Like, that's what you are, and that's the trade-off. That you get to retire at 12 years old, and you're not a real country.
Just your regular reminder that Europe is not a continent, despite what you get taught at school. It is an ideological construct of imperialism. Let me explain. And if you're new here, my name is Ollie. I'm a professor of human geography, so I know about this sort of stuff, okay? So a continent is a large landmass, not an island, but a landmass surrounded by large bodies of water. And so Europe isn't a continent. Eurasia is the continent because Europe connects to Russia, connects to India and China, and all the way into Southeast Asia. So Europe, as we currently understand the idea of a continent, isn't one. So why do we call it a continent? Well, it goes back to the ancient Greeks. Millennia ago, when they became a seafaring, trading empire, essentially, they traveled in different directions, obviously to the west through the Mediterranean, and they had different kinds of trade with those people than they did if they traveled east through the Dardanelles and up through the Bosphorus in modern day Istanbul towards the Black Sea. And actually it was the differences in trading which meant that they had different names. To the east was Asia and to the west was Europe. Of course, that gets enshrined in further empires like in the Roman Empire and indeed the European empires, the French and the Spanish and British and everything else. But of course what happens is that the trading routes still exist, and the trading routes with Asia, because of the rich resources over in Asia, all the spices and the sugars and everything else, they become part of the power play. And so the Europeans want to dominate that land, and so they carve it up ideologically. And of course race is a massive part of this as well. It enshrines whiteness into the sort of geopolitical centre and the core regions of the medieval world, i.e. Europe. If you want to know more about the history, there's actually a really great book by Martin Lewis, no not him, and Karen Vegan called The Critique of Metageography, written in the 90s, and it goes into really great detail about this history, so I can recommend that if you want to know more. And of course that filters through to today. Look at the ways in which the European Union got together after World War II to create a political entity of Europe. It just enshrines this idea of a naturalized planetary force, i.e. a continent, when it's nothing of the sort. It is a political ideology based in colonialism, based in whiteness.
What language we use about China? Are you a competitor? Are you an ally? Are you a threat? How would you regard your relationship with Britain?
First of all, between China and Britain, from the Chinese perspective, Britain is not a rival, is not a competitor, it is not an enemy, is not an adversary. Britain is just an important country to get along with in peace and in friendship and for mutual benefit. Now, how Britain looks at China, it's up to the British government and people to decide. But I think it will be completely misguided for Britain to view China as an enemy or adversary or a competitor. What do China and Britain compete with? China is the largest manufacturer of automobiles. Competing with Britain? No. China is the largest exporter of EV cars and will lead the whole world in EV production. Is Britain a competitor? No. China will be the biggest and most important producer and R&D in terms of semiconductor in no time. Does that mean that China competes with Britain? No. China will be the leading nation in AI revolution. Is Britain a competitor? No. So I think British government should not overestimate its impact on the global scene and view Britain as a rival of China. China is not. China is a fact. China is a megatrend for Britain to live with and get along with. Let's make peace.
You accept that Britain still has a role in Hong Kong as a guarantor of that agreement, which was originally signed by both China and the United Kingdom. There would be one state, two systems until the year 2047.
There may be people in London who want to stick to that interpretation. However, if you really read the joint declaration, everything terminates at the time when Britain handed over the sovereignty back to China at midnight, June 30th, 1997. After 1997, Britain is just like any other country in the world in its relations with Hong Kong or in its relations regarding the one country, two system principle.
Let me get this clear then. The joint declaration is dead, correct?
No, the joint declaration terminated when the British government handed over the sovereignty back to China midnight June the 30th, 1997.
This is not how 2 million people on the streets of Hong Kong see it. It's not how the British government sees it. What do you say when the British government says there are going to be serious consequences if Beijing doesn't accept Britain's right to have a say in this?
No, first of all, I think whatever the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom said in terms of bad consequences is purely bluffing. I believe between China and the United Kingdom, for example, the United Kingdom is no position to bluff against China and force China to kowtow to Britain. Those years and that historical period had passed by forever, and United Kingdom can better serve its own interest and serve the fundamental interests of the British people if it deals with China with respect, with dignity, with equality, and with decency.
If anyone in Britain thinks that the Chinese government or the authorities at large would have any interest in hacking into the British politicians' accounts to gain information, I think that allegation is ludicrous. And if anyone in the Chinese government or authorities want to do that, it's completely out of their mind.
The British security services have spent 2 years or more looking at these allegations. Clearly somebody was hacking into the MPs' accounts and indeed into the Electoral Commission. So if it wasn't China, then who could it have been?
I would say China is fully engaged in so many things domestically, as well as in dealing with the headwind in the international arena, and no one has any additional bandwidth to care about the domestic elections in Britain.
Bon, alors pourquoi vous me faites dire ça? Donc, moi je vous dis, tout le monde se bat. Vous avez vécu quelque chose de terrible. Tout le monde se bat, quelle que soit la couleur de peau. Et n'opposez pas les gens. N'opposez pas les gens. Si vous opposez les gens, on est foutus. Parce que vous êtes contents d'être en France. Parce que si c'était pas la France, pour vous dire, vous seriez 10 000 fois plus dans la merde. Il n'y a pas un endroit de l'océan Indien où on aide autant les gens. C'est la réalité. Et donc, on ne peut pas vouloir être un département français et dire que ça ne marche pas dès que la France est en solidarité. Quel est l'autre territoire de cette région comme ailleurs qui livre de l'eau, du fret, des soignants comme on le fait ici? Alors, il faut que tout le monde se respecte. Mais bon sang, on tiendra jusqu'au bout si on est une équipe. Et donc, vous avez un choix simple. Vous êtes une équipe ou vous divisez.
Macron is losing his foothold on French territories around Africa, African countries, the islands. We are done with Macron, right? He's going to be the last person to figure out, because he's really struggling. But deep down, I already know that he knows that he's losing control. And we love it. If you're an African, we have been waiting for years to see the demise of France, okay? France has done nothing but destruction. Listen, this is not pitting colonizers against colonizers and stuff like that, but go look at France's history. France is nasty, okay? And then they leave the French language till this day, and then they don't want to remove it. And when those people are saying, hey, we want to speak our own local language, he fights it. He says French is going to be the language speaked in all these in African countries, because he has this colonizer dream. It hasn't ended, right? Because his ancestors back in 1843, when they took over Comoros and they took over this Mayotte island, well, Comoros got its independence earlier, but he still has a foothold on Mayotte. He won't let it go. So much so that now that Mayotte has had a cyclone, just how much meltdown it has. Well, then why do you, I'm telling you, everyone's struggling. You've been through something terrible. Everyone's struggling, regardless of color, regardless of skin color. Don't pit people against each other, don't pit people against each other. If you don't pit people against each other because you're happy to be part of France, because if it weren't for France, you'd be 10,000 times more in deep shit. Without France, this man is in the mix of these people and is telling them without France, they would be shit. This man needs to go. Not only does he need to go, they all need to go and get out of Africa. For reference, I want to show you this Mayotte people, right? The French territory that Macron acts like it's not about color, it's not about color. So in this place, right, you have a lot of Bantu people in Mayotte, or Mayotte. I don't know how to pronounce it, guys. That's surrounded by Comoros, right? In those areas, you have Malagasy people, which are Malaysian and Madagascan, and then you have Bantu. But don't sleep, okay? Arabs, Islam has been through there because a great majority of them are also Islam, okay? So here we are, and these people are still trapped, and Macron can stand in front of a crowd of these people and tell them that they ain't shit without France. The same France who's taking their resources, who's taking from them, does not give them any fair trade and equal trade to nothing. We are so sick of white colonizers in Africa. I don't even know how to begin. In Belgium, you are next. Dango.
The government of Mali has dropped French names assigned to roads, squares, and other public facilities in the capital, Bamako. Mali said on Wednesday, December 18th, that the move decolonizes the minds of the Malian people, removes monuments in honor of the colonizer, and ensures a return to national identity. Mali now joins its Sahel neighbors, Burkina Faso and Niger, in dropping French names assigned to public facilities in the countries. In a decree signed by Mali's transitional president, General Assimi Goïta, the street named after West African regional bloc ECOWAS has also been renamed the Alliance of Sahel States, AES Avenue. AES is a three-member confederation comprising Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. It was founded in September 2023 as part of the three countries' efforts to counter ECOWAS, which had imposed sanctions on each of the nations at different points in time over recent coups. So far, the Malian government has changed nearly 25 names of public facilities to erase French links. Mali has largely chosen its national figures as the replacement names. The government says this move will allow the country to pay tribute to its national figures as well as immortalize them so that they forever remain in the collective memory of Malians. The government adds that the move will also give young people historical landmarks, references, and inspiring role models, as well as preserve cultural heritage. Mali also says that its decision would help restore and rehabilitate our history and the figures who distinguished themselves through their great deeds. Mali, which is Africa's second largest gold producer behind Ghana, got independence from France in 1960 after nearly 70 years of being under French rule. The Malian government has in recent times ramped up efforts to reclaim the management of its natural resources, mainly minerals from foreign companies. That has led to strained relations between Mali and Canadian firm Barrick Gold, which is the world's second largest gold miner and has operated in Mali for 30 years. Mali has since issued an arrest warrant for Barrick Gold CEO Mark Bristow. Mali's neighbors, Niger and Burkina Faso, have also turned the screws on former colonial ruler France. The two African nations, just like Mali, have pushed out French troops from their soil and already made several changes to street names and monument names in the last 2 years. In October 2024, Niger renamed several historic sites in its capital, Niamey, which previously bore references to France.
Let's look at France. It's had another setback, this time in Central Africa. Yesterday, it lost its last remaining base in the Sahel region. It has been asked to get out of Chad. Chad is a country in Central Africa. It was once a French colony, like a lot of other African nations. Chad became autonomous on 28 November 1958, and it became fully independent 2 years later in 1960. But the 28th of November is still a special date in Chad. It marks an important step towards freedom, which is why Chad chose yesterday, the 28th of November, to break with France again. Their government put out this notice. It terminated a defense agreement. The agreement allowed France to deploy troops in Chad. But now Chad has torn it up, which means French troops deployed there will have to leave. There are 1,000 French soldiers deployed here. They will have to start packing up soon. But how did this happen? What led to this? Look at the timing. The French foreign minister has just concluded his visit to Chad. He met with Chad's president, Mohamed Deby. We don't know what they discussed, but right after that meeting, Chad tore up the defense pact. Their foreign minister said, and I'm quoting, France must now also consider that Chad has grown up, matured, and is a sovereign state that is very jealous of its sovereignty. It's an understandable reason why should Western powers station their troops in former colonies. Imagine if the British left thousands of soldiers in India. If British troops remained here decades after India's independence, it wouldn't have been acceptable to us. So we do understand wanting to guard sovereignty, but this is only one part of the story. There are two more. To understand the second part, we need to zoom in. France had many colonies in Africa. Let's show you a belt stretching from Chad all the way to Mauritania. All these former colonies hosted French troops. They were all part of a security grouping called the G5 Sahel. All these former French colonies were dealing with a common problem, terrorism. That was France's justification to deploy troops. But they failed to fix the problem. They failed to contain the terrorist groups. So slowly the African nations started getting annoyed. 3 of them recently had coups: Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. Their militaries overthrew the civilian governments and then they kicked out the French troops as well. These coup-hit Sahel nations blame France for their terror problem. They say the French troops were not doing enough. And ordinary people seem to agree because anti-France sentiment has been brewing in the Sahel. It's prevalent in Chad as well. And this may have contributed to the government's decision. The third and the last reason for this break may have been Russia. Moscow has been courting African nations, especially former French colonies. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger have all switched allies. They kicked out the French and they brought in the Russians. Russian mercenaries to help the military juntas. And Chad has a similar situation. President Mohamed Deby is the son of a military dictator. His father, Idriss Deby, ruled for 30 years. Mohamed took over after he died. He orchestrated a coup and then held what is called a questionable election to consolidate power. So Deby may also want some Russian support to shore up his legitimacy. Russia has been reaching out to Chad. They've signed a few deals and a broader alliance is definitely possible. All these factors have influenced Chad's latest move: the desire for sovereignty, the anti-France sentiment, and the desire for Russian support. Chad was France's last stronghold in the Sahel. Now it has fallen. And France's troubles may not be over yet. There are rumblings from another former French colony, Senegal. Senegal's president has also taken aim at French troops. He says their time is almost up. So it looks like things will get worse for Paris in the days to come.
Do you really want to talk about what Europe was doing in Africa? Rape, pillage, mass murder, torture, and slavery. That's what you were doing. That's what you were doing with all of your good brains and all of your good ideas. Stealing everyone's resources to take them back to your allegedly blessed good climate of Europe. And how are you going to talk about what Africa doesn't have when you either destroyed it or you stole it, anything that they did have? And you made yourselves wealthy and comfortable in Europe by doing that. You know, the kingdom of Benin, you destroyed the great city walls of Benin, the royal palace, you looted and you pillaged, and the same in Mali, the same in Zimbabwe, on and on. You destroy everyone else's stuff and then brag about being the only one who has stuff. You know, it bewilders me. Every argument that Westerners make to substantiate their claim that their so-called civilization is superior, every argument is materialistic. We have nice things. We invented all the technology of the modern world and so on. You don't realize that when you make that argument to the global south, well, we're living in the background where all that technology comes from. It comes from our minerals, our rare earths, our mines, our ravaged environments, and our subjugated labor. We're living in the part of the Apple logo where the bite is. So that doesn't impress anyone in Africa or Asia or Latin America. You have nice stuff. Yeah, we know how you got it. We know how you got it. And it wasn't by brilliance, it was by brutality. It was then and it is now. So you should really stop using that argument. It's self-incriminating.